Hello guys. Welcome back to my channel. Did you even ask the owner of this house for permission? The question left my mouth with a calm I hadn't expected. I had just opened the door to my condo, grocery bags still dangling from my arms, and there she was, Chloe, my daughter-in-law, standing right in the middle of my living room as if it were nothing. There were two enormous suitcases at her feet and an expression that mixed surprise with something worse. Annoyance. As if I were the intruder. As if my arrival had ruined her perfectly laid plans. She looked up at me, blinked twice, and then let out that uncomfortable little laugh she used whenever someone confronted her. It was a short, sharp laugh designed to make the other person feel ridiculous. But I didn't look away. I stood there on the threshold of my own home, holding the heavy bags filled with produce and canned goods, waiting for an answer she clearly hadn't prepared. "Hey, Ava. I didn't hear you come in." Her voice sounded light, almost musical, as if we were having a casual conversation about the weather, as if the suitcases didn't exist, as if it were completely normal for her to be in my condo on a Thursday afternoon without warning me, without asking, without showing the slightest consideration for the fact that this was my space, my refuge, the only place in the world where I could still breathe without anyone demanding anything of me. I didn't move. I stayed right there in the doorway, feeling the weight of the bags beginning to leave red marks on my forearms. But I didn't drop them. Something inside me had hardened the exact moment I saw those suitcases. Something that had been soft, pliable, always ready to give in. For years, I had finally found a boundary. "I asked you a question, Chloe." My voice came out firmer this time. She tucked a strand of her perfectly styled hair behind her ear, that gesture she made when she needed to stall for time to think about what to say. Her eyes, painted with light shadows that matched her designer blouse, avoided mine for a second before she looked back at me with that small, condescending smile I despised so much. "Ava, please don't exaggerate. Dion and I only need to stay for a few days. They're doing renovations in our condo and the noise is unbearable. The crew starts at 6 a.m. and doesn't leave until 7 o'clock p.m. We can't sleep. We can't work. We can't live like this. We figured it wouldn't be a problem to come here. After all, you live alone and you have 2 bedrooms you don't even use." There it was. That one sentence that perfectly summed up what my family thought of me. You live alone and you have rooms you don't use. As if my life were an empty space waiting to be filled by the needs of others. As if the fact that no one was sleeping in the rooms next door automatically turned my home into a resource available to whoever needed it. As if my 68 years of existence didn't grant me the right to decide how, when, or with whom to share my space. I finally walked into the apartment and set the bags on the dining room table. The sound of the canned goods hitting the wood was louder than I had expected. Chloe took a step back, barely perceptible, but I noticed it. Her body language had changed. She wasn't so relaxed anymore. The discomfort was starting to filter through the mask of security she always wore. I stood beside the table, not unpacking the groceries, not moving toward the kitchen as I normally would. My hands rested on the wooden surface, and I could feel my own pulse beating in my fingertips. It wasn't fear. It wasn't nerves. It was something different. It was the feeling of reaching a point of no return. "Does Dion know you're here?" The question was rhetorical. I already knew the answer, but I needed to hear it. I needed to confirm what I already suspected, that my son had allowed this, that he had been part of this plan from the start, that they had both decided together that my consent wasn't necessary. Chloe let out a long, dramatic sigh as if I were being unreasonably difficult. "Of course he knows, Ava. It was his idea. Actually, he's finishing up some business at the office, and we'll be over later with the rest of our stuff. I thought he'd have called to tell you." He didn't call. No, he didn't call. And that silence, that absence of a simple phone call, told me everything I needed to know. My son, Dion, the child I'd raised alone after his father disappeared from our lives when he was only 7 years old. The same one I fed with the salary from my double shifts, cleaning offices and serving coffee. The same one who hugged me when he was little and said that when he grew up he would take care of me forever. That very son now considered it perfectly acceptable to move into my house without consulting me, as if I were an extension of his convenience, a resource at his disposal. I walked toward the suitcases. I stood in front of them, staring as if they were alien objects dropped from another planet. They were expensive, those brands Chloe flaunted on social media. Shiny, new, probably bought during one of those trips they took every couple of months, while I was still using the same worn-out suitcase I'd bought 15 years ago at a liquidation sale. And you thought this was okay? Showing up at my house with your suitcases without asking if I was agreeable, without considering for even a moment that maybe I had plans, that maybe I value my privacy, that maybe I don't want people living here. Chloe crossed her arms over her chest. Her posture changed. She was no longer the casual, relaxed daughter-in-law. Now there was defensiveness in every line of her body. Ava, you're Dion's mother. We're family. I don't understand why you're making this so complicated. It's only for a few days, maybe a week. It's not like we're asking for something impossible. Besides, I thought you'd be happy to have company. You always say this place feels empty. Empty. The word echoed in my head like a funeral bell. Yes, I had once mentioned that the house felt silent after my sister Olivia moved out to live with her daughter last year. But there was an enormous difference between silence and empty. My house was silent because I chose it that way. Because after decades of noise, of demands, of being available to everyone but myself, I had finally found peace in the stillness. But Chloe had taken that casual confession and turned it into a justification, as if my moment of vulnerability gave her permission to invade my space, as if admitting I sometimes felt lonely was the same as begging someone to come fill every corner of my life without asking me first. Listen to me closely. My voice was low but firm. Chloe stopped moving. Something in my tone made her pay real attention for the first time since she'd arrived. This house can feel however it wants to feel to me. It can be silent or it can be full of noise. It can be empty or it can be complete. But what it will never ever be is available to anyone who decides to use it. And my permission. I am the owner of this house, Chloe. Not a convenient option when you two have a problem. She opened her mouth to reply, but at that moment we heard the sound of a key in the lock. The door opened and Dion, my son, walked in, carrying 2 more bags and wearing that carefree smile he used when he thought everything was under control. Mom, glad you're home. Chloe explained it to you, right? We'll only be here for a week, 2. At the most. You won't even notice we're here. Don's words floated in the air as if they were the most reasonable thing in the world. He set the bags on the floor next to the suitcases, dusted his hands on his pants, and looked at me with that expression I knew too well. It was the same look he had when he was 12 years old and came home late after playing basketball with his friends, expecting me not to get mad because he was just being a normal kid after all. Except Dion wasn't 12 anymore. He was 42, and I was no longer that young, exhausted mother who gave in to every smile because I was too tired to fight another battle. I stood by the dining room table, my hand still resting on the wood, watching him enter my condo as if it were his own territory, as if the last 40 years hadn't passed, as if continuing to be his mother meant I had automatically surrendered any expectation of respect or consideration. Dion approached and tried to give me a kiss on the cheek. I didn't move. I didn't pull away, but I didn't lean in either. I stayed exactly where I was, and he must have noticed something in my posture, because he stopped halfway, a look of confusion briefly crossing his face before turning into a wider, more forced smile. What's wrong, Mom? Did you have a bad day? A bad day? As if my reaction were the result of a passing mood. As if the problem was that I'd had to wait too long in line at the bank or that traffic had been heavy. Not that my son and daughter-in-law had decided to move into my home without consulting me. Not that they had treated me as if my opinion were irrelevant. Not that they had assumed my life, my space, my peace were resources available for their convenience. I didn't have a bad day, Dion. I had an unpleasant surprise when I got home to find your wife moving in here without anyone asking me if I agreed. Dion chuckled, a genuine laugh as if he just heard something funny. He ran a hand through his hair, that gesture he made when he thought someone was overreacting, and shook his head. Mom, please don't be dramatic. I called you twice this morning, and you didn't answer. I figured you were out and we could get settled before you got back. It's not that big of a deal. I looked over at Chloe, who was now standing next to the suitcases with her arms still crossed, watching the exchange with a mixture of discomfort and something that dangerously resembled satisfaction, as if my confrontation with Dion was proving something she already suspected, that I was difficult, that I was unreasonable, that I was the obstacle in a situation that should have been simple. You called twice, and when I didn't answer, you decided that was enough authorization to move into my house. We're not moving in, Mom. We're just staying for a few days. Dion moved toward the kitchen, opened the refrigerator casually, grabbed a bottle of water I'd bought that afternoon, and drank straight from it. That small gesture, so insignificant to any external observer, felt like a confirmation of everything I'd been thinking. He saw no difference between his space and mine. To him, my house was an extension of his. My refrigerator, my food, my privacy, it was all part of a shared territory where he had unlimited access. I closed my eyes for a moment, trying to control the pressure building in my chest. It wasn't anger yet. It was something deeper, older. It was the accumulated weight of decades of being the person who always yielded, who always understood, who always put others' needs before her own. It was the weariness of having spent my entire adult life being useful, available, and convenient for everyone but myself. How many days is a few days, Dion? He shrugged, still drinking the water, not looking directly at me. A week? 2 at the most. The crew said they'd finish up fast. It's just until we can sleep in our own bedroom again without waking up to the sound of drills at 6 a.m. 2 weeks. 14 days of having 2 people in my space, using my bathroom, eating my food, interrupting my routine. 14 days of not being able to walk in my pajamas through my own living room if I woke up thirsty in the middle of the night. 14 days of having to consider other schedules before deciding if I could watch my favorite show or listen to my music. 14 days of giving up the peace I had worked so hard to build after years of noise and chaos. And you just assumed I'd be okay with that? Dion finally capped the water bottle and looked at me with something that tried to look like patience, but was really thinly veiled condescension. Mom, you're my mother. Of course. I assumed you'd be okay with it. What did you want us to do? Stay in a hotel and spend $150 a night when you have 2 empty bedrooms here? That doesn't make sense. $150 a night. There was the real truth, naked and unadorned. It wasn't about needing me. It wasn't about wanting to spend time with me. It was about money, about economic convenience, about how using my apartment for free was more sensible than paying for their own comfort. And I, as always, was expected to understand, to be reasonable, to place their financial needs above my emotional tranquility. Chloe cleared her throat from her spot next to the suitcases. When she spoke, her voice had adopted that soft, conciliatory tone people use when they want to sound reasonable while manipulating a situation to their advantage. Ava, we really don't want to cause you any trouble. If it's a problem, we can help with expenses. I don't know, maybe $50 extra for utilities. We'll be using water and electricity. It's only fair we contribute. $50. As if the problem were the cost of utilities. As if I could put a price tag on my privacy, my routine, the quiet mornings where I sat on my balcony with a cup of coffee and simply existed without having to be a mother, a mother-in-law, a hostess, or any other role others needed me to play. It's not about money, Chloe. My voice came out wearier than I intended. Dion approached again, this time putting a hand on my shoulder with that gesture he'd used 1,000 times when he wanted to soften me up. Then what is it about, Mom? Just tell me what's bothering you, and we'll fix it. You want us to buy the groceries? Perfect. No problem. You want us to clean everything before we leave? We can do that, too. You don't want us making noise in the mornings? We'll be silent as mice. Tell me what you need, and we'll do it. What I needed was for them to have asked me first. What I needed was for them to have considered that maybe I had the right to say no. What I needed was for them to understand that being family didn't mean having automatic access to every aspect of my life without my consent. But how could I explain that without sounding like the selfish mother, the difficult mother-in-law, the unreasonable woman who refused to help her own family in a time of need? I gently moved Dion's hand from my shoulder, not with abruptness, but with enough firmness for him to know the gesture wasn't welcome right now. What I need, Dion, is for you to understand that this is my house, not a hotel, not a backup option, not a resource available every time you have an inconvenience. It's the place where I live, where I rest, where I have the right to decide who enters and who stays. But we're your family, Mom. His response was immediate, almost automatic, as if those 4 words were an irrefutable argument, as if the simple fact of sharing blood nullified any expectation of respect or consideration. And maybe for a long time I had believed that. Maybe for years I had accepted that being family meant always being available, always understanding, always willing to sacrifice my own needs for theirs. But something had changed. Maybe it was turning 68 and realizing that time was no longer infinite. Maybe it was the death of my friend Serena last year, who spent her last days regretting never having lived for herself. Maybe it was simply the accumulated exhaustion of decades of being invisible in my own life. Precisely because you are my family. This hurts me more, Dion, because I would expect you more than anyone to understand that I also have a right to my space, to my peace, to my decisions. Dion exchanged a glance with Chloe. It was quick, barely a second, but I saw it. It was that look couples share when they think they're dealing with someone difficult, when they need to stick together in the face of what they perceive as a shared problem. And in that moment, I was the problem. Dion let out a long sigh, the kind he used when he felt a conversation was taking too long to get nowhere. He ran both hands over his face, a gesture of barely contained frustration, and then looked at me with that expression he had perfected over the years, that of the patient son dealing with a complicated mother. Fine, Mom. I get that you're upset because we didn't give you more notice. You're right about that, but we're already here. The bags are inside. Chloe's already unpacked a few things in the guest room. What do you want us to do now? Go look for a hotel at 6 p.m. on a Thursday when I have meetings starting at 7 a.m. tomorrow. There was the guilt presented not as a direct emotion, but as a series of practical inconveniences I would be causing if I insisted on holding my ground. As if the fact that they had already started settling in without my permission now obligated me to accept the situation. As if their lack of planning automatically became my problem to solve. I looked down the hall toward the bedrooms. The guest room door was slightly ajar, and from where I stood, I could see a corner of the bed with what looked like clothes already spread out on it. Chloe had said she had unpacked a few things. She wasn't asking permission to stay. She was claiming territory. I walked toward that room. I heard Dion's footsteps behind me, and then Chloe's voice saying something low to him that I couldn't quite make out. I pushed the door completely open, and what I saw confirmed what I already suspected. Not only were there clothes on the bed, but toiletries were lined up on the dresser. Chloe's travel case was open by the mirror. 2 pairs of shoes were neatly arranged by the wall. A laptop was plugged in next to the nightstand. This wasn't the preparation of someone planning to stay for a few days. This was the installation of someone planning to settle in for weeks. I turned to face Dion, who had stopped in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, watching me cautiously. "A week, you said." He nodded, though his eyes avoided mine for a second before looking back. 2 at the most. "Mom, I told you. And all of this setup is for 2 weeks. The laptop, the bath products, enough clothes for a month." Dion shrugged, that casual gesture he used when he wanted to minimize something he knew was important. "Chloe needs to work from here, and obviously we brought what we needed to be comfortable. We weren't going to live out of a suitcase for 2 weeks. Comfortable. The word resonated in my head. They needed to be comfortable in my house, in my space, using my resources. And apparently, I just needed to be understanding. I left the room and returned to the living room where Chloe was now sitting in my favorite armchair, the one by the window, the one I had bought 3 years ago after saving up for months. She had her phone in her hand, scrolling with the casual concentration of someone who had no immediate worries. When she saw me enter, she looked up and offered me another one of those small smiles. "Ava, we really will be as little trouble as possible. You won't even notice we're here. I work remotely, so I'll be in the room most of the day. Dion leaves early and comes back late. We can buy our own food if you want, or cook for the 3 of us, however you prefer. However, I prefer." As if all these options she was presenting were genuine. As if she were really giving me decision-making power and not simply offering variations of a situation I had. That you should have treated me with the same respect you would treat anyone else you were asking a huge favor of. It's not a huge favor, Mom. It's letting your son sleep in your guest room for a few days. It's giving up my privacy for 2 weeks. It's changing my entire routine. It's sharing my bathroom, my kitchen, my living room, every space where I breathe. It's giving up the peace that cost me so much to achieve after years of living for everyone but myself. Dion looked up at the ceiling as if seeking divine patience, and then looked back at me with that tired expression he used when he felt someone was being unnecessarily complicated. "You know what, Mom? I think the real problem here is that you've been alone for too long. You've become selfish. I'm not saying this to hurt you, but it's the truth. You weren't like this before. You always had your doors open for me. For anyone. Do you remember when you let my friend Marcus live here for 3 months when his parents kicked him out? Do you remember when your sister Olivia practically lived here for a whole year? You never said anything. You never complained about your privacy or your routine back then. Of course, I remembered. I remembered Marcus, who was 19 then, with nowhere to go after his dad kicked him out for flunking out of college. I remembered cleaning up his dirty dishes every morning, doing his laundry because he never had time, cooking for 2 when I barely had enough money for 1. I remembered Olivia, my older sister, who stayed with me after her divorce and turned my small condo into her healing space, while I kept working double shifts to keep both our finances afloat. I remembered all that, and I also remembered how I felt during those periods. Invisible, exhausted, resentful, but incapable of expressing it because the people I loved needed me. And I had learned from a young age that women like me existed to be needed, not to need. You're right, Dion. I didn't say anything before. I swallowed my discomfort and I smiled and I pretended everything was fine while I faded away a little more each day. I used to believe that being a good mother, a good sister, a good person meant constantly sacrificing myself for others. But you know what? I got tired. I got tired of being the convenient solution to everyone else's problems. I got tired of my generosity being taken for granted. I got tired of waiting for someone to ever ask me what I needed. But we did ask you what you needed, Mom. We just asked you a moment ago. We told you to tell us what you want us to do. You asked me what I wanted after you'd already made the decision for me, after you'd already settled in, after the situation was already in motion. That's not asking. That's asking for retroactive permission, expecting me to feel so guilty for refusing that I end up giving in anyway. I walked out of the kitchen. I couldn't stay in that confined space with Dion looking at me as if I were the problem, as if my resistance were a character flaw instead of a legitimate boundary. I returned to the living room where Chloe was now standing by the window, arms crossed, watching the street below. She turned around when she heard me enter, and for the first time since she arrived, I saw something different in her expression. It wasn't her usual confidence. There was caution there now, maybe even a little worry. Dawn came out of the kitchen behind me, and the silence that filled the room was so thick, I could almost feel it pressing against my skin. None of the 3 of us spoke for a moment. We just stood there forming an uncomfortable triangle of accumulated tension. Finally, Chloe was the one to break the silence. Her voice had lost that casual, confident tone. Now it sounded more careful, as if she were choosing every word with precision. Ava, if you really don't want us to stay, we can find another solution. We don't want you to feel uncomfortable in your own home. I looked at Dion, expecting him to back up what his wife had just said. But he was looking away, his jaw tight, clearly annoyed at how this whole situation was unfolding. And in that moment, I understood something I should have understood years ago. My son wasn't going to defend me. He wasn't going to acknowledge they had made a mistake. He wasn't going to validate my feelings or apologize for assuming my life was at his disposal. Because to him, I was still that mother who always said yes. That mother who moved mountains to make things easy for him. That mother whose love was measured in silent sacrifices and ignored needs. And any deviation from that pattern wasn't personal growth on my part, but a flaw that needed to be corrected. I sat down in the armchair by the window, the one Chloe had abandoned a few minutes ago. My legs were tired. My whole body was tired. In truth, it wasn't just the physical exhaustion from going to the grocery store or standing during this endless conversation. It was a deeper exhaustion, the kind that accumulates over decades of carrying the emotional weight of other people without anyone offering to help with your own. I want you both to explain something to me, and I want an honest answer. Dion finally looked at me, his arms crossed over his chest in a defensive posture. What do you want us to explain? If the situation were reversed, if I showed up at your condo with my bags without warning, saying I needed to stay for 2 weeks because there was a problem with my building, would you welcome me without a second thought? I saw the exchange of glances between Dion and Chloe. It was quick, barely a second, but it was enough. They both knew the answer, and they both knew the answer was different from what they expected of me. Chloe cleared her throat, searching for the right words. Well, we'd have to think about it. Our place is smaller, and we both work from home now. It would be complicated with the space. And exactly, it would be complicated. You'd have to think about it. You would consider your needs, your space, your comfort, and you'd be completely within your rights to do so. No one would judge you for protecting your privacy. No one would call you selfish for wanting to keep your routine intact. No one would expect you to sacrifice your peace of mind just because I'm family. But you're my mother, Mom. It's different. Dion had taken a step toward me, his hands outstretched, as if he were trying to explain something obvious that I wasn't grasping. Why is it different? Because I'm your mother? Does that automatically mean I have less right to my own life? Does it mean my needs matter less than yours? Does it mean I can be ignored, invaded, and taken for granted because my role is to serve you? I'm not saying that, but you're demonstrating it, Dion, with every decision you make without consulting me, with every assumption that I'll be available, with every time you minimize how I feel because it doesn't align with what you need me to be. I stood up from the armchair and walked toward the suitcases that were still by the entrance. I looked at them as if I were seeing them for the first time. They were physical concrete objects, but they represented something much larger. They represented years of unestablished boundaries. They represented decades of teaching my son that my space was his space, that my time was his time, that my life was a shared resource he could take from without asking. And I had been the one who taught him that. I had created this pattern. For years, I had prioritized being the perfect mother, the available mother, the mother who never said no without realizing that, by doing so, I was slowly erasing any expectation of reciprocity or respect. Dion approached and put his hand on my shoulder again, more gently this time. Mom, please, let's not make this harder than it has to be. We just want a place to sleep for a few days. We're not trying to take anything from you, but they were taking something from me. They were taking my ability to decide over my own life. They were taking my right to say no without being punished with guilt. They were taking the possibility of existing as something more than an extension of their needs. I moved my shoulder away from his hand, not aggressively, but with enough firmness for him to understand that the gesture was unwelcome. This is my house, Dion. I pay the rent. I pay the utilities. I decide who comes in. And right now, I'm deciding that I need you both to leave. The silence that followed my words was so absolute that I could hear the ticking of the wall clock in the kitchen. Dion stood completely still, his hand still suspended in the air where my shoulder had been, looking at me as if he hadn't correctly understood what I had just said. Chloe let out a small sound, something between a gasp and a disbelieving laugh. "What did you say?" Dion's voice sounded strange, higher than normal, as if the words had gotten stuck somewhere between his throat and his mouth. He ran a hand over his face, took a deep breath, and then looked at me with an intensity one hadn't seen in years. "Mom, please tell me you're joking." "I'm not joking. I need you to take your things and leave." Chloe took a step forward, her hands raised in a gesture intended to be conciliatory, but which actually barely contained desperation. "Ava, wait. We can talk about this. If we did something wrong, we can fix it. You don't have to kick us out. We're family." That word again used as a shield, as justification, as if it were an automatic pass that annulled any need for basic respect. As if sharing blood meant I had to tolerate anything except any invasion, forgive any lack of consideration, precisely because you are family. This hurts so much because I would expect you more than anyone to understand that I also deserve to be treated with dignity. Don let out another laugh, this time longer, sharper, loaded with disbelief. He turned around, walked a few steps toward the window, then came back as if the movement helped him process what was happening. "This is insane. You're being completely irrational. You're going to kick your own son out on the street? Why? Because we showed up a few hours before we could talk to you. Because we didn't follow some ridiculous protocol you just invented? I didn't just invent anything, Dion. Asking before moving into someone's home isn't a ridiculous protocol. It's basic respect. It's what you would do with anyone else in your life. It's what you'd expect others to do with you." He shook his head, his hands on his hips, looking at me as if he were seeing a stranger. "I can't believe you're doing this after everything we've done for you." That sentence dropped between us like a stone in still water. Everything they had done for me. I waited for him to elaborate, to tell me specifically what that everything referred to, but he didn't continue. He just stood there breathing heavily as if those words were enough of an argument by themselves. "Everything you've done for me. Tell me, Dion, help me remember what exactly you two have done for me that justifies me giving up my peace of mind." Dion opened his mouth, then closed it. He looked at Chloe for support, but she was looking at the floor, biting her lower lip. He looked back at me, and now there was something different in his expression. It wasn't just disbelief or frustration. There was genuine, escalating rage. "You want a list? Fine. We bought you that new TV last year when yours broke down. I offered to pay you back for it. You told me it wasn't necessary, that it was a gift. And then you mentioned it at every family dinner for the next 6 months as an example of your generosity. We drove you to the emergency room when you twisted your ankle because I had no way to get there, and you were passing by on your way home, and you dropped me off at the hospital entrance. You didn't come in with me. I waited 3 hours alone until a nurse got me a cab to get back. We invite you to dinner every time we celebrate something. You invite me when you need someone else to pay part of the bill or when you need to look good in front of other people, showing that you're good kids who include their mother. But at those dinners, you talk between yourselves, check your phones, make plans that don't include me. I'm just there as family decoration." Dion took a step toward me, and there was something dangerous in his movement now. Not physically threatening, but charged with an emotion that was about to overflow. "You know what your problem is, Mom? Nothing anyone does for you is enough. There's always something wrong. There's always a but. You always find a way to play the victim. I'm not playing the victim. I'm setting a boundary. There's a huge difference. No. What you're doing is punishing me because your life didn't turn out the way you wanted. Because Dad left. Because you had to work hard. Because you feel lonely. And now, when I finally have some stability, when I can finally ask you a favor, you decide it's the perfect time to collect emotional debts for things that happened decades ago." His words felt like physical blows, each one designed to hurt me, to make me doubt myself, to turn my legitimate boundary into an act of unjustified revenge. And the most painful part was that there was a kernel of truth in what he said. Yes, I felt lonely sometimes. Yes, I had carried resentments for years. Yes, there were moments when I looked at my life and wondered where all the time, all the energy, all the version of myself that existed before I became a mother, an employee, the person everyone needed me to be had gone. But that didn't change the fact that I had a right to my space, that I deserved to be consulted, that my life wasn't a territory available for invasion just because my son decided he needed it. You're right about one thing, Dion. My life didn't turn out the way I wanted. But you know what part didn't turn out the way I wanted? The part where I raised a son who sees me as a resource instead of a person. The part where I spent so many years being useful that I forgot how to be valued. The part where I convinced myself that love was measured in silent sacrifices and ignored needs. Chloe intervened, her voice trembling but trying to sound reasonable. Ava, please. We understand you're upset. We understand we made a mistake by not consulting you first. But kicking Dion out, kicking your own son out, is a disproportionate reaction. It's cruel. Cruel. The word resonated in my head. It was cruel to protect my space. It was cruel to set boundaries. It was cruel to say no. But it wasn't cruel to show up unannounced. It wasn't cruel to assume my life was at their disposal. It wasn't cruel to minimize my feelings or treat me as invisible. The cruelty apparently only went in one direction. You know what's really cruel? Raising a son alone for decades, sacrificing every dream I had, working until my hands bled and my back could no longer straighten, all to ensure he had opportunities one never did. And then when I finally get a little peace, a little space to breathe, I discover that to him I'm just a convenience, a place to stay when it's cheaper than a hotel. That's not fair. Don had raised his voice now, and his cheeks were red with contained emotion. I didn't ask to be born. I didn't ask for Dad to leave. I didn't ask for you to have to work so hard. Those were your decisions, your circumstances. You can't blame me for that. Now, I'm not blaming you for any of that, Dion. I'm blaming you for not seeing that I am a person, too. For treating me as if my only function is to make your life easier. For showing up here today and acting like my consent didn't matter. He walked toward the suitcases, grabbed one of them with more force than necessary, and looked at me with a mixture of pain and anger that made it difficult to meet his gaze. You know what, Mom? You're right. We're leaving. I don't need this. I don't need to be in a place where I'm clearly not welcome, where my own mother treats me like a stranger. I'm not treating you like a stranger. I'm treating you with the same standard you treat me without prior consideration. Dion lifted the suitcase, stumbling slightly with its weight, and headed for the door. Chloe followed him, taking the other suitcase. But before reaching the exit, she turned to look at me one last time. I hope this is worth it, Ava. I hope your space and your peace are worth losing your son over. My son is not lost because I set a boundary. If he leaves and doesn't return, it's because he chose to value his comfort more than our relationship. It's because he preferred to be angry than to be wrong. Don had already opened the door and was stepping out into the hallway when he suddenly stopped. He turned around, looked at me with a strange expression I couldn't immediately decipher, and then to my complete surprise he let out a sharp laugh. It wasn't a laugh of joy. It was a bitter, sarcastic laugh loaded with disbelief. This is perfect. Truly perfect. Wait until I tell everyone how my mother kicked me out of her house for daring to ask her for help. Wait until the family hears about this. Wait until Aunt Olivia knows that the generous Ava, the one who always has her doors open, now she's gotten so selfish that she won't even help her own son. There was the veiled threat, the promise that if I stood by my decision, he would make sure everyone knew what kind of terrible mother I had become. That he would call my sister, my cousin Tanisha, anyone who would listen and tell them his side of the story. A version where he was the innocent victim and I was the cruel mother who had abandoned him in his moment of need. For a second, I felt the familiar weight of guilt pressing against my chest. That automatic impulse to yield, to apologize, to say that everything had been a misunderstanding and that of course they could stay. That instinct that had been cultivated over decades of being the person who kept the peace, who avoided conflict, who sacrificed her own comfort to avoid being seen as difficult. But then I remembered something my friend Serena had told me 3 months before she died. We were sitting in her hospital room and she had taken my hand with fingers that barely had any strength left and looked at me with those tired eyes that had seen too much of life. "Ava," she had said, her voice barely audible above the constant beeping of the machines. The biggest mistake I made was caring more about what people thought of me than what I thought of myself. I spent 70 years trying to be what others needed, and now that I'm dying, I can't remember a single moment when I lived for myself. Those words had been ringing in my head since her funeral, and now, standing across from my son and his implicit threat to destroy my family reputation, I understood that the moment had come to decide what mattered more, the image others had of me or the truth of who I really was. Go ahead, Dion. Call whoever you want. Tell them whatever you want. If your version of events is that you asked respectfully and I denied you help for no reason, then so be it. But we both know that's not the truth. We both know you showed up here unannounced, assuming my house was your house, treating me as if my consent were irrelevant. Dion slammed the suitcase down on the floor with a dry thud. His eyes were bright now, not with tears but with pure rage. "You know what, Mom? You're right. I didn't ask for permission. And you know why? Because I never thought I'd have to ask my own mother for permission to stay in her house for a few days. Because I grew up believing that family helps without conditions. Because you taught me throughout my entire childhood that the doors of this house would always be open to me. Then I taught you wrong. I taught you that love meant unlimited access. That being family meant I had no right to say no. I taught you that my space was your space and that my needs mattered less than yours. And now I'm correcting that mistake." Chloe intervened again, and now there were real tears running down her cheeks, though I wasn't sure if they were from sadness or frustration. "Please, Ava, Dion, let's all calm down. It doesn't have to end this way. We can find a solution." "We can't. There's nothing to solve. Chloe, you need a place to stay. I need my space. Those two things are not compatible. It's not complicated." Dion picked up the suitcase again and walked toward the hallway, stopping right at the doorway. He didn't look at me when he spoke, and his voice sounded different now, colder, more distant. "When you change your mind, when you realize what you just did, don't expect me to come back as if nothing happened. Don't expect me to forget that you kicked me out when I needed you. I didn't kick you out when you needed me, Don. I kicked you out when you decided that needing meant you could ignore me." He stepped out into the hallway without saying anything more. Chloe picked up the second suitcase, but before leaving, she turned to look at me. Her face was red, stained with tears, and there was something in her eyes that resembled genuine confusion. "I don't understand you, Ava. I really don't. What kind of mother does this? The kind of mother who finally learned that loving herself is not an act of selfishness, it's survival." She shook her head, mumbled something I couldn't quite hear, and walked out into the hallway where Dion was already waiting for the elevator. I stayed standing on my doorstep watching them. Dion's back was rigid, the posture of someone who felt profoundly betrayed. Chloe was checking her phone, probably looking up nearby hotels. The elevator arrived with a soft electronic chime. The doors opened. Dion entered first, dragging his suitcase with a jerky movement that made it hit the frame. Chloe followed, and just before the doors closed, Dion looked at me one last time. He didn't say anything, but the expression on his face said it all. Disappointment, anger, incomprehension, and something deeper. Something that resembled the genuine pain of someone who felt they had just lost something important. Part of me wanted to run to the elevator, stop the doors before they closed, tell them to come back, tell them I was sorry that they could stay. That part of me that had spent decades learning to prioritize the emotional comfort of others over my own. That part that had been trained to believe that conflict was the worst possible outcome, worse even than my own unhappiness. But I didn't move. I stood there watching the elevator doors close, listening to the mechanical sound of its descent, knowing that with every floor they went down, I was also closing a chapter of my life. I went back into my condo and closed the door. The silence that greeted me was different from other nights. It wasn't the comfortable silence of chosen solitude. It was the heavy silence of consequences, of difficult decisions, of bridges I might have just burned. I walked toward the guest room where Chloe had begun to settle in. The clothes were still spread out on the bed. The toiletries were still lined up on the dresser. The laptop was plugged in next to the nightstand, its indicator light blinking softly in the room's gloom. I began to put away their things. I folded the clothes carefully, though my hands trembled slightly. I put the toiletries in a plastic bag. I unplugged the laptop and placed it on the bed with the other belongings. I didn't do it out of cruelty. I did it because I needed to reclaim this space. I needed it to stop being the place where someone else had decided to settle without my permission and return to being simply my guest room. Empty, yes, but empty by my choice. When I finished, I left everything neatly arranged on the bed. If Dion or Chloe came back for their things, they would find them ready, respected, and cared for. Because that was the kind of person I was. Someone who could set firm boundaries without needing to be cruel. Someone who could say no without destroying what belonged to the other. I returned to the living room and sat down in my armchair by the window. Outside, the evening was beginning to darken. The lights in the neighboring condos were turning on one by one small illuminated windows in the twilight. I wondered how many of those windows held stories similar to mine. How many women were sitting in their own living rooms wrestling with the weight of having set a boundary. How many were asking themselves if they had done the right thing? My phone vibrated in my sweater pocket. I took it out and saw a message from Dion. Just 3 words. Hope you're happy. I didn't reply because I wasn't happy. There was nothing joyful about what had just happened. There was no victory in having closed the door on my own son. There was no satisfaction in knowing that weeks, maybe months, would likely pass before we spoke again. But there was something else, something that wasn't happiness, but that felt important nonetheless. There was clarity. There was the certainty that, for the first time in decades, I had chosen my own dignity over the comfort of others. There was the sense that I had recovered something I hadn't even known I had lost. The right to say no without having to justify myself endlessly. Another message arrived. This one was from Chloe. Dion is very upset. I don't think he'll call you for a long time. I hope your pride is worth it. My pride? As if setting boundaries were a matter of pride. As if protecting my space were an act of vanity instead of self-care. As if the problem were my resistance and not their invasion. I turned off the phone, not because I was running away from the consequences of my actions, but because I needed silence. I needed to process what had just happened without the constant interference of messages designed to make me feel guilty. I got up and went to the kitchen. The grocery bags were still on the table, exactly where I'd left them what felt like hours ago, but had probably only been 45 minutes. I started putting the groceries away, moving on autopilot. The vegetables went into the refrigerator, the canned goods into the pantry. The bread stayed in its usual basket on the counter. Every object found its designated place, and there was something comforting in that simple routine. Amidst the emotional chaos I had just gone through, these small actions anchored me to something tangible and predictable. When I finished putting everything away, I made myself a cup of tea. I heated the water, chose my favorite mug, the light blue ceramic one I'd bought at a local market years ago, and watched the leaves slowly expand in the hot water. The familiar aroma enveloped me, and for the first time since I had opened the door to my condo that afternoon, I felt like I could fully breathe. I sat down again in my armchair with the mug between my hands. The heat of the tea seeped through the ceramic and warmed my palms. Outside, Night had completely fallen. The city continued with its constant rhythm, indifferent to the small drama that had just unfolded in my sixth-floor apartment. And then, without warning, I started to cry. They weren't dramatic sobs. It wasn't the heartbroken weeping of someone who had just lost something irreplaceable. They were silent tears that simply ran down my cheeks while I remained seated, holding my tea, looking out at the darkness beyond the window. Tears that had been waiting decades for their turn to come out. I cried for the mother I had been, that young woman who worked 2 shifts and came home so tired she could barely stay awake to help Dion with his homework. I cried for the years I had spent convincing myself that constant sacrifice was love, when in reality it was just fear. Fear of not being enough. Fear that if I didn't give myself completely, my son wouldn't love me. Fear of ending up alone. And now here I was alone anyway. But it was a different kind of solitude. It wasn't the result of abandonment or rejection. It was the consequence of choosing my own dignity. And though it hurt, though it felt as if I had lost something important, there was also a strange sense of relief, like when you finally let go of something heavy you've been carrying for so long that your arms had forgotten what it felt like not to carry it. I remembered a specific moment when Dion was 8 years old. It had been a particularly difficult day at my coffee shop job. A customer had yelled because his order took too long. My boss had reprimanded me for something that wasn't my fault, and I had come home with my feet so swollen I could barely walk. Dion was in the living room watching television when I walked in. "Mom," he had said without taking his eyes off the screen. "I'm hungry." I had dropped my bags by the door, kicked off my shoes that were squeezing my aching feet, and gone straight to the kitchen to prepare him something to eat. I hadn't even sat down first. I hadn't even taken a moment for myself, because that's what good mothers did. Good mothers put their children's needs before everything else. But what was I really teaching him with that behavior? I was teaching him that women existed to serve, that mothers had no boundaries. That saying, "Give me a minute, I'm tired," was selfishness instead of basic self-care. And now, 34 years later, my son had grown up believing exactly that. It wasn't entirely his fault. I had been his most consistent teacher in that mistaken lesson. Every time I had ignored my own needs for his, every time I had smiled despite being exhausted, every time I had pretended everything was fine when I was actually falling apart inside, I had taught him that I didn't matter as much as he did, and he had learned the lesson perfectly. I took a sip of my tea. It was getting cold, but the familiar taste comforted me anyway. I thought of Serena again, of those last conversations we had in the hospital. She had been so brave in the end, facing death with a brutal clarity that only comes when there's no time left for comforting lies. "You know what's the saddest thing, Ava?" She had told me one afternoon while I was peeling an orange to share with her. "It's not that I'm dying. We all die eventually. The sad thing is that I spent my whole life waiting for the moment when I could finally live for myself. When the kids grew up, when I retired, when I had more money, when. And now that moment is never going to come because I ran out of time." She had squeezed my hand with surprising strength for someone so frail. "Don't make my mistake. Don't wait until it's too late. If you need to say no, say it. If you need space, take it. If you need to choose yourself, do it because no one else is going to do it for you." I finished my tea and placed the empty mug on the side table. I remained seated in the silence of my condo, listening to the distant sounds of the city. A car passed on the street below. Someone laughed in one of the neighboring apartments. Life continued, indifferent to my small personal revolution. My phone vibrated again. This time, it was a message from my sister Olivia. Dion had already called her. Of course, the news of what I had done was already circulating through the family. "Ava, what happened?" "Dion called me very upset, saying you kicked him out of your house. He says they only needed to stay for a few days. Is that true? Call me when you can." I could perfectly imagine that conversation. Dion presenting himself as the misunderstood victim. Olivia always so diplomatic, trying to understand both sides. but probably leaning towards sympathy for Don because he was the baby of the family after all. And I would be painted as the difficult mother who had suddenly become selfish in her old age. I should have felt anger at the prospect of being misinterpreted. I should have wanted to call Olivia immediately to give my side of the story, to defend myself, to ensure everyone understood that I wasn't the villain in this story. But I realized something important. I didn't care as much as I thought I would. Because the truth was, Olivia, despite being my sister and loving me in her own way, had never truly understood why I had allowed her to stay in my condo for a full year after her divorce. She had never recognized the sacrifice that had represented for me. She had assumed, like everyone else, that I had plenty of space and plenty of time and plenty of energy, because that was what women like me had. Scraps of ourselves to distribute to whoever needed them. I wasn't going to call her. At least not tonight. Maybe tomorrow, maybe the day after, or maybe never. Maybe it was time to let people think what they wanted to think. Maybe it was time to stop expending my energy trying to control the narratives others constructed about me. I got up from the armchair and walked toward my bedroom. As I passed the guest room, I glanced inside. Chloe's things were still there, neatly arranged on the bed. I would have to call Dion tomorrow to tell him he could come pick them up whenever he wanted. But that was a problem for tomorrow, not tonight. In my bedroom, I changed slowly. I put on my most comfortable pajamas, the soft cotton ones that were a little worn, but felt like a hug. I washed my face, brushed my teeth, following each step of my nightly routine with deliberate slowness. Each action was a silent affirmation. This is my space. This is my time. This is my life. I got into bed and turned off the light. The darkness enveloped me, and with it came a thought I hadn't expected. Pure and simple relief. I wouldn't have to wake up early tomorrow because of the noise of other people moving around my condo. I wouldn't have to share the bathroom or wait my turn for coffee. I wouldn't have to moderate my behavior or consider the needs of others before deciding what I wanted to do with my day. But along with the relief came the weight of the pain too, because my son was angry with me because there was a rift in our relationship that I didn't know when or how it would be repaired because I had chosen my peace over his convenience. And that choice had consequences I would have to face. I allowed myself to feel both things at once. The relief and the pain, the certainty of having done the right thing, and the sadness of the consequences, the strength of having established boundaries, and the vulnerability of not knowing what came next. I closed my eyes and gradually let sleep take me. Before falling completely asleep, I had one final thought. Maybe this was what it meant to truly grow up. Not when you formally became an adult. Not when you had a job or a house or even a child. But when you finally learned that loving yourself was not selfishness. It was responsibility. It was justice. It was the only way to live with integrity. And with that thought, I finally allowed myself to rest. I woke up the next day with sunlight streaming softly through my bedroom window. For a moment, in that hazy space between sleep and waking, everything seemed normal. But then the memory of what had happened the previous night returned with the force of a cold wave, and I lay there looking at the ceiling, slowly processing the fact that I had kicked my son out of my house. I got out of bed and followed my morning routine, just as I always did. I went to the bathroom, washed my face with cold water, brushed my teeth. Each familiar action helped anchor me to the present, to remember that life continued despite the emotional drama of yesterday. But when I left my bedroom and walked toward the kitchen, I couldn't help but look toward the guest room. The door was still ajar. Chloe's things were still on the bed, waiting to be claimed. I made coffee. The rich aroma filled the kitchen as I took out my favorite mug and waited for the coffee maker to finish its work. I poured myself a cup, added a splash of milk as usual, and sat down by the living room window. Outside, Friday morning was in full swing. People were walking to their jobs. Kids were on their way to school. The world kept turning, completely oblivious to the small personal earthquake I had experienced. My phone was on the table where I had left it the night before. I turned it on with some apprehension, knowing there would probably be more messages. And there were 3 more from Olivia each one more insistent than the last. One from my cousin Tanisha, asking if I was okay, and one from Dion that simply said, "I'm coming by this afternoon to pick up our things. You don't need to be there if you don't want to." I read that last message several times, trying to decipher the tone behind the words. Was it consideration? Was it coldness? Was it his way of giving me an out? Of allowing me to avoid an awkward confrontation? I wasn't sure, but what I did know was that I wasn't going to hide in my own home. If Dion was coming to get his things, I would be here. I replied with a simple, "I'll be here. Ring the bell when you arrive." I spent the morning cleaning, not because the condo was dirty, but because I needed to keep my hands busy. I vacuumed the entire living room. I wiped down the kitchen counters until they shone. I changed the sheets on my bed, even though I had changed them just 3 days prior. It was physical therapy, a way to process the whirlwind of emotions still churning inside me. Around noon, I finally decided to call Olivia, not because I felt I owed her an explanation, but because she was my sister and despite everything, I cared what she thought. I dialed her number and waited while it rang. "Ava, thank goodness. I've been worried all night." Olivia's voice sounded genuinely distressed, and something in me softened a bit. "Hi, Olivia. I'm sorry I didn't answer sooner. It was a rough night. Dion told me what happened. Well, he told me his version. I want to hear yours." At least she hadn't automatically assumed Dion was right and I was wrong. I mentally for that before starting to explain the situation. I told her about the suitcases at the entrance, about how they hadn't consulted me, about the conversation we'd had, and how it had escalated until I finally asked them to leave. Olivia listened in silence, interrupting me only occasionally with clarifying questions. When I finished, there was a long pause before she spoke. "I understand why you felt that way, Ava. I really do. But don't you think maybe you overreacted a little? It's Dion. He's your son. Surely you could have found a way to resolve this without kicking him out." There was the answer I had been expecting. That subtle suggestion that I had exaggerated, that I had taken things too far. And maybe she was right. Maybe there were other ways to handle the situation. But I also knew that if I had given in, if I had allowed them to stay after showing up without asking, I would be teaching Dion once again that my boundaries didn't matter. I didn't overreact, Olivia. I reacted appropriately. Dion is 42 years old. He's a grown man with a steady job and enough resources to pay for a hotel. He decided it was more convenient to use my space without consulting me. That's not okay. No matter how much I love him. But that's just how families are, isn't it? We help each other when there's a need. We don't ask permission every time we need something. I should have known Olivia would say something like that. She had lived with me for a year after all. And during that time I had never charged her rent, never asked her to contribute significantly to expenses, never put a time limit on finding her own place. I had been the generous, available, understanding sister, and now that I was setting boundaries, I must have seemed like a hypocrite. Do you remember when you lived with me after your divorce, Olivia? There was an awkward silence on the other end of the line. Of course, I remember. You were so generous to let me stay. Do you know why I didn't ask you to leave after a few weeks, or even a few months? Olivia didn't answer immediately, and I continued before she could because I was scared. I was scared. I was afraid that if I set boundaries, if I asked you to find your own place, you would think I was selfish, that I didn't love you enough, that I was a bad sister. So, I swallowed my discomfort and my need for personal space, and I let you stay because that's what good sisters did. Ava, I didn't know you felt that way. You never said anything. Exactly. I never said anything. And that was my mistake, because by not saying anything, I taught everyone around me that I had no boundaries, that they could take what they needed from me without worrying about the cost it had for me. And now, after decades of doing that, I'm finally learning to use my voice. And it hurts. It hurts to set boundaries. It hurts to disappoint people. But it hurts less than continuing to disappear in my own life. Olivia sighed deeply. I don't know what to tell you, Ava. I understand what you're saying. I really do. But Dion is very hurt. He's saying he won't talk to you for a long time. That is his choice. I'm not punishing him. I'm just protecting my space. If he decides that's reason enough to cut contact with me, then that says more about him than it does about me. We talked for a few more minutes before hanging up. The conversation hadn't ended badly, but it hadn't left me with the feeling of having been completely understood either. Olivia was a product of the same generation as me, raised with the same expectations about what it meant to be a good woman, a good mother, a good sister. It was difficult for her to understand why I was rejecting those rules now, after having followed them so faithfully for so long. At 3:00 p.m., the doorbell rang. Before falling completely asleep, I had one final thought. Maybe this was what it meant to truly grow up. Not when you formally became an adult. Not when you had a job or a house or even a child. But when you finally learned that loving yourself was not selfishness. It was responsibility. It was justice. It was the only way to live with integrity. And with that thought, I finally allowed myself to rest. I woke up the next day with sunlight streaming softly through my bedroom window. For a moment, in that hazy space between sleep and waking, everything seemed normal. But then the memory of what had happened the previous night returned with the force of a cold wave, and I lay there looking at the ceiling, slowly processing the fact that I had kicked my son out of my house. I got out of bed and followed my morning routine, just as I always did. I went to the bathroom, washed my face with cold water, brushed my teeth. Each familiar action helped anchor me to the present to remember that life continued despite the emotional drama of yesterday. But when I left my bedroom and walked toward the kitchen, I couldn't help but look toward the guest room. The door was still ajar. Chloe's things were still on the bed, waiting to be claimed. I made coffee. The rich aroma filled the kitchen as I took out my favorite mug and waited for the coffee maker to finish its work. I poured myself a cup, added a splash of milk as usual, and sat down by the living room window. Outside, Friday morning was in full swing. People were walking to their jobs. Kids were on their way to school. The world kept turning, completely oblivious to the small personal earthquake I had experienced. My phone was on the table where I had left it the night before. I turned it on with some apprehension, knowing there would probably be more messages. And there were 3 more from Olivia, each one more insistent than the last. One from my cousin Tanisha, asking if I was okay, and one from Dion that simply said, "I'm coming by this afternoon to pick up our things. You don't need to be there if you don't want to." I read that last message several times, trying to decipher the tone behind the words. Was it consideration? Was it coldness? Was it his way of giving me an out? Of allowing me to avoid an awkward confrontation? I wasn't sure, but what I did know was that I wasn't going to hide in my own home. If Dion was coming to get his things, I would be here. I replied with a simple, "I'll be here. Ring the bell when you arrive." I spent the morning cleaning, not because the condo was dirty, but because I needed to keep my hands busy. I vacuumed the entire living room. I wiped down the kitchen counters until they shone. I changed the sheets on my bed, even though I had changed them just 3 days prior. It was physical therapy, a way to process the whirlwind of emotions still churning inside me. Around noon, I finally decided to call Olivia, not because I felt I owed her an explanation, but because she was my sister and despite everything, I cared what she thought. I dialed her number and waited while it rang. "Ava, thank goodness. I've been worried all night." Olivia's voice sounded genuinely distressed, and something in me softened a bit. "Hi, Olivia. I'm sorry I didn't answer sooner. It was a rough night. Dion told me what happened. Well, he told me his version. I want to hear yours." At least she hadn't automatically assumed Dion was right and I was wrong. I mentally for that before starting to explain the situation. I told her about the suitcases at the entrance, about how they hadn't consulted me, about the conversation we'd had, and how it had escalated until I finally asked them to leave. Olivia listened in silence, interrupting me only occasionally with clarifying questions. When I finished, there was a long pause before she spoke. I understand why you felt that way, Ava. I really do. But don't you think maybe you overreacted a little? It's Dion. He's your son. Surely, you could have found a way to resolve this without kicking him out. There was the answer I had been expecting. That subtle suggestion that I had exaggerated, that I had taken things too far. And maybe she was right. Maybe there were other ways to handle the situation. But I also knew that if I had given in, if I had allowed them to stay after showing up without asking, I would be teaching Dion once again that my boundaries didn't matter. I didn't overreact, Olivia. I reacted appropriately. Dion is 42 years old. He's a grown man with a steady job and enough resources to pay for a hotel. He decided it was more convenient to use my space without consulting me. That's not okay. No matter how much I love him. But that's just how families are, isn't it? We help each other when there's a need. We don't ask permission every time we need something. I should have known Olivia would say something like that. She had lived with me for a year after all. And during that time I had never charged her rent, never asked her to contribute significantly to expenses, never put a time limit on finding her own place. I had been the generous, available, understanding sister, and now that I was setting boundaries, I must have seemed like a hypocrite. Do you remember when you lived with me after your divorce, Olivia? There was an awkward silence on the other end of the line. Of course, I remember. You were so generous to let me stay. Do you know why I didn't ask you to leave after a few weeks, or even a few months? Olivia didn't answer immediately, and I continued before she could because I was scared. I was scared. I was afraid that if I set boundaries, if I asked you to find your own place, you would think I was selfish, that I didn't love you enough, that I was a bad sister. So, I swallowed my discomfort and my need for personal space, and I let you stay because that's what good sisters did. Ava, I didn't know you felt that way. You never said anything. Exactly. I never said anything. And that was my mistake, because by not saying anything, I taught everyone around me that I had no boundaries, that they could take what they needed from me without worrying about the cost it had for me. And now, after decades of doing that, I'm finally learning to use my voice. And it hurts. It hurts to set boundaries. It hurts to disappoint people. But it hurts less than continuing to disappear in my own life. Olivia sighed deeply. I don't know what to tell you, Ava. I understand what you're saying. I really do. But Dion is very hurt. He's saying he won't talk to you for a long time. That is his choice. I'm not punishing him. I'm just protecting my space. If he decides that's reason enough to cut contact with me, then that says more about him than it does about me. We talked for a few more minutes before hanging up. The conversation hadn't ended badly, but it hadn't left me with the feeling of having been completely understood either. Olivia was a product of the same generation as me, raised with the same expectations about what it meant to be a good woman, a good mother, a good sister. It was difficult for her to understand why I was rejecting those rules now, after having followed them so faithfully for so long. At 3:00 p.m., the doorbell rang. I got up from the sofa where I had been reading. I took a deep breath and went to open the door. On the other side was Dion. He was alone. There was no sign of Chloe. He was carrying 2 large canvas bags, likely to put the things they had left behind in. "Hello, Mom." His voice was flat, without emotion. It wasn't hostile, but it wasn't warm either. It was the voice of someone fulfilling an uncomfortable obligation. "Hello, Dion. Come in." He moved past me without making eye contact and headed straight for the guest room. I closed the door and stood in the living room, not knowing whether I should follow him or give him space. I finally decided to stay where I was, but left the guest room door in view. I could hear him moving around the room, opening and closing drawers, the sound of the bag zipping up. It took him about 10 minutes to pack everything. When he came out, he had both bags hanging from his shoulders, and his expression was still that carefully neutral mask. He stopped in the living room halfway between the bedroom and the exit door. For a moment, I thought he was going to say something important, that maybe this was the opportunity for a real conversation. But instead, he simply nodded toward the hallway. "Can I use the restroom quickly before I leave?" "Of course." He put the bags down by the door and went into the bathroom. I heard the water running, the familiar sound of someone moving through a space they knew well. And in that moment, the reality of what I had done hit me. Not the part about setting boundaries or protecting my space. That still felt right. But the part about how my son, my only son, now felt like a stranger in the house where he had grown up. How he had to ask my permission to use the bathroom. How the distance between us had grown so quickly in just 24 hours. He came out of the bathroom and picked up the bags again. He headed toward the door, and I followed him. He opened the door, stopped on the threshold, and finally looked directly at me. "Is there anything you want to say, Mom?" There were so many things I wanted to say. I wanted to tell him I loved him. I wanted to explain once more why I had to do what I did. I wanted to ask him if we could ever have a relationship where I was seen as something more than a convenient resource. But what came out of my mouth was something different. "I love you, Dion. I will always love you. But I'm no longer going to sacrifice my well-being to avoid your discomfort. If that means spend time without speaking, then so be it. But the door will always be open for a relationship where we both respect each other mutually." He nodded slowly as if he were processing my words. He didn't say he loved me, too. He didn't say he understood. He just nodded. "Goodbye, Mom." "Goodbye, Dion." The door closed behind him with a soft sound that resonated much louder than it should have. I stood in that exact spot for several minutes, looking at the closed door, listening to the absolute silence that filled my condo. There were no footsteps in the hallway, no voices, just silence. I walked back to the living room and sat down in my armchair by the window. My hands were trembling slightly, so I clasped them in my lap and breathed deeply, trying to calm my racing heart. I had done it. I had maintained my boundary, even when my son had come to collect his things with that hurt expression on his face. Even when every fiber of my motherly being wanted to run after him, apologize and beg him to come back. The next few days passed with a strange slowness. I woke up every morning and followed my routine. Coffee, shower, breakfast, but everything felt different. Now there was a weight in the air, a constant awareness that I had broken something. Though I wasn't sure if what I had broken was my relationship with Dawn, or simply the dysfunctional pattern we had maintained for decades. Olivia called me twice more that first week. In the second call, her tone had changed. It was no longer just worry. There was something more there. "Ava, I've been thinking a lot about what we talked about when I lived with you after my divorce." I heard the sound of her taking a breath on the other end of the line as if she were gathering courage. "I never properly thanked you for that year. I never recognized what you sacrificed to give me space. I just assumed you were fine with it because you never said otherwise. But I should have asked. I should have been more considerate. I hadn't expected that apology. I felt something loosen in my chest, something I hadn't even known was tight. Thank you for saying that, Olivia. It means a lot. Maybe you were right about what you told Dion. Maybe we all took it for granted that you would always be available, that you would always say yes, that you would never have your own needs." 2 weeks passed before I received the next message from Dion. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a conversation, just a photo. It was an image of him and Chloe in front of what looked like their newly renovated condo. The message read, "Renovations are finished. We're back home." He didn't mention anything about what had happened. He didn't ask how I was. It was a cold, factual message, the kind of update you would send to a distant acquaintance rather than your mother. But it was something. It was a thin thread of communication. And I decided to take it for what it was, a small first step. I replied, "I'm glad you're comfortable in your space now. Take care." There was no response after that. The days turned into weeks. I continued with my life. I went to the grocery store on Thursdays as always. I met my friends for coffee on Tuesdays. I read books I had been putting off for months. I spent entire afternoons sitting on my balcony, simply observing the city, something I had never allowed myself to do when I was constantly waiting for someone to need me. And slowly, very slowly, I began to notice something. The guilt I had been carrying, that constant feeling that I had done something terrible, began to diminish. In its place appeared something different. It wasn't happiness exactly. It was more like peace, like the feeling of having finally set down something heavy after carrying it for so long that your arms had forgotten what it felt like to be free. A month after the incident, I was at the market choosing tomatoes when my phone rang. It was Dion. A real call, not just a message. My heart sped up as I looked at his name on the screen. I put the tomatoes back in their place and moved away from the crowd a bit before answering. Hello. Hi, Mom. His voice sounded different. It had lost that defensive tone it had had the last time we spoke. How are you? I'm well. And you? There was a long pause. I could hear background noise, maybe traffic, as if you were walking down the street. I've been thinking a lot about what happened, about what you said. I didn't say anything, waiting, giving him space to continue. You were right, Mom. Not about everything. I still think you could have handled it differently, but you were right about the main thing. I showed up without asking. I assumed you would be available because you always have been, and that wasn't okay. I felt something loosen in my chest, something that had been tight for weeks. Thank you for saying that, Dion. Chloe and I have been talking. She says she's always felt like I take you for granted, that I treat your generosity like it's an obligation instead of a gift. And I think she's right. I listened to the words coming out of my son's mouth and felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. Not the naive hope that everything would go back to the way it was because I didn't want it to be the way it was, but the hope that maybe we could finally build something new, something more honest. I appreciate you telling me this. I know it wasn't easy. Mom, I was wondering if we could have lunch together. Just you and me. No Chloe, no pressure. Just a talk. Would you like that? I surprised myself by smiling. I'd love that. We agreed to meet the following Saturday at a small restaurant halfway between our condos. When I hung up, I realized tears were running down my cheeks, but these were different from the ones I had cried that first night. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of the possibility of healing. Saturday arrived, and I found myself nervous in a way I hadn't experienced in years. I changed clothes 3 times before settling on a simple brown dress that made me feel comfortable and dignified at the same time. I arrived at the restaurant 5 minutes early and waited at a table by the window. Dion arrived exactly on time. He looked different, too. There was something in his posture, in the way he approached the table, that was more humble than before. He sat down across from me, and for a moment we simply looked at each other. Hi, Mom. Hi, son. We ordered food, and at first the conversation was clumsy, full of awkward pauses, but gradually, as we ate, the words began to flow more easily. Dion told me about his job, about the issues they were having with one of his projects. I asked him about Chloe and how she was handling the stress of her own work. And then, between the main course and dessert, Dion put down his fork and looked directly at me. Mom, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen fully before you respond. I nodded, feeling my stomach tense with anticipation. My whole life, I've seen you as my mother first and as a person second. I never stopped to think about who you were beyond what you did for me, and that was selfish. It was unfair, and I'm sorry. His voice cracked slightly on the last words, and I saw that his eyes were moist. When you kicked me out of your house, I was furious. I thought you were being cruel, that you were punishing me for something I didn't understand. But after weeks of thinking about it, talking to Chloe, even talking to a therapist I started seeing, I realized something. I realized I've never asked you what you need. I've never considered that your life doesn't exist solely in relation to mine, and that has to change. Tears ran freely down my face now, and I didn't try to stop them. I don't need you to be the perfect mother who always says yes to everything. I need to know the real person, Ava, not just Mom. And if that means you sometimes tell me no, that you sometimes set boundaries, then I accept it. Because I'd rather have an honest relationship with you than continue living in this pattern where I take and you give until there's nothing left of you. I reached my hand across the table and took his. It was warm and slightly trembling. Thank you, Dion. You don't know how much it means to hear that. We spent the next 2 hours truly talking. Not the superficial conversation we had maintained for years, but a real conversation about who we were, what we needed, and how we could have a relationship that worked for both of us. It wasn't perfect. There were awkward moments, difficult admissions, and truths that hurt to speak, but it was real, and that was infinitely more valuable than the false harmony we had maintained before. When we finally said goodbye at the restaurant door, Dion hugged me. Not the quick, obligatory hug of family gatherings, but a real long hug. The kind of hug that says, I see you. I value you. I love you for who you are, not just for what you do for me. The following months weren't perfect. There were relapses, moments when Dion fell back into old patterns of taking my availability for granted. But the difference was that now I had a voice and he was learning to listen. I learned that teaching respect to your children doesn't end when they grow up. Sometimes the most important lesson comes when you finally say no. When you finally establish the boundary you should have established years ago. When you finally choose yourself without apologies. Because being a mother doesn't mean being invisible. It doesn't mean sacrificing every part of yourself on the altar of maternal love. It doesn't mean your house, your time, your life are resources available to whoever needs them without your consent. Being a mother means loving deeply, but it also means teaching your children that real love includes respect, that healthy relationships have boundaries, that you too are a person with needs, dreams, and the fundamental right to decide over your own life. That Thursday afternoon, when I found the suitcases at my entrance, was not the end of my relationship with my son. It was the beginning of a new relationship, one built on honesty instead of obligation, on mutual respect instead of unilateral sacrifice, on true love instead of dysfunctional patterns inherited from generations that taught us women existed to serve. And when I sit in my armchair by the window now with my hot cup of coffee in my hands, looking at my quiet, tidy condo, I feel something I hadn't felt in decades. Pride. Pride. Pride in having chosen myself. Pride in having found my voice. Pride in having taught my son that love doesn't mean the absence of boundaries but the presence of respect. My house is still my house. My life is still my life. And I, Ava Holloway, at 68 years old, am finally the owner of both. You know, for most of my life, I thought love meant giving everything until nothing was left of me. But now I see that love also means saying enough and still having room in your heart to forgive, to grow, and to start again. Setting boundaries doesn't destroy love, it protects it. And when we finally learn to respect ourselves, others start to see our worth, too. That's the peace I found, and I wish the same for you. If you feel the same way and liked my story, show it by giving this video a like. Let's see how many of us there are. I'm curious where and what time are you listening from? Write it in the comments. If you'd like to support my journey, you can send me a small donation. Thank you for listening and sharing your precious time with me. For more life stories like this, check out the other videos on my channel and subscribe. On the screen, you'll find 2 new stories I'm sure you'll enjoy. Click one and start listening right away. Love. Thanks for watching.